Hello, I'm Charles J. Shields. Contrary to legend, he never said there's a sucker born every minute. Phineas Taylor Barnum was a businessman, a hoaxer, and an impresario who provided entertainment to a nation hungry for it. "I'm a showman by profession," he said, "and all the gilding shall make nothing else of me," he wrote defiantly in his autobiography. In the authoritative Life of Barnum, author Neil Harris, professor of history at the University of Chicago, describes the culture and climate of America in the 19th century, one that produced such an outsized and sometimes outrageous figure as P.T. Barnum. Harris has written widely on various aspects of the evolution of American cultural life and on the social history of art and design. And now, the life of showman P.T. Barnum.
Thank you very much, Charles, for that introduction. Thank you for being here, and thank University of Mary Washington for inviting me and for their pleasant hospitality. Phineas Taylor Barnum bore a name that still evokes wide recognition 120 years after his death. But pressed into saying just what they know about him, I think most Americans would come up with some references to the greatest show on earth, a few pat phrases like "there's a sucker born every minute," which of course he never uttered, and an image shaped by crossing W.C. Fields with one of Groucho Marx's felonious con men like J. Cheever Loophole, whom you may remember from one of his films. Barnum-esque hasn't officially entered any dictionary that I could find, but it is informally used as a synonym for the exaggerated, the overwrought, the sensational, the stagey, and the histrionic, to choose just a few adjectives. When I began work on this celebrity more than 40 years ago, I confess that I wouldn't have been able to add much to these impressions. Growing up in New York, I had made as a child several supervised visits to the Barnum and Bailey Ringling Brothers Circus in Madison Square Garden. And there, on posters, were the avuncular features of a rather benevolent-looking patriarch, meant, of course, to be Barnum. He was long since gone by then, but most everything else about him, especially his highly creative pre-circus years, were unknown to me, including the fact that he had written what was probably the best-selling autobiography in 19th century America, rivaled only by the still better-known patriot, diplomat, and homespun philosopher Benjamin Franklin. And this was really where I got started. My first involvement with Barnum was an assignment to edit a new edition of the autobiography. Like a number of other things in my life, it got out of hand as I became more and more impressed by his actual life, and the new edition never appeared. Instead, I became drawn into Barnum's complicated career, and I decided to write a separate book, which I titled Humbug. It was not literally a biography, but an attempt to make sense of his success. I wasn't the first to be attracted to this task. Dozens of biographies and commentaries had appeared. Most sought to make Barnum into a representative American, although just what he represented differed from author to author. Variously presented as a pioneering master of advertising, a shrewd business manager, a confidence man, a prototypical Yankee, an exploiter of freaks, a libertine, a Promethean bringer of pleasure to an overworked society, an enemy of Puritanism, a paragon of middle-class morality, a crusader for free speech, and a materialistic Philistine. All of these were Barnum's. The Barnum that I offer up to you tonight was most of the above, but perhaps reflecting our current age, I see him most clearly as a performance artist who exploited his widely publicized feats as an art form, the rare show business manager who ultimately overshadowed his acts. He understood his audiences and their needs, and he turned this talent into wealth and fame. Smart and shrewd, though not well-read or well-educated, Barnum knew, as our current media giants know, that exposure is crucial to celebrity, that notoriety increases fame, and that behind-the-scenes revelations can be endlessly fascinating. For much of his career, he followed this road until toward the end he discovered the still greater economic rewards of promoting spectacle. Adroit at making this transition, he remains one of the craftiest, most creative practitioners of American publicity, an enduring symbol to many of national genius and national sin, and also a somewhat enigmatic one, shielding his private life and real thoughts behind the mask of apparent disclosure. The private Barnum has always remained beyond my reach, but there is enough, I hope, in the public man to sustain our interest. Barnum was born in Connecticut on July 5th, 1810, having overrun Independence Day by 24 hours. It was one of the few big targets in life that he missed, and this failure could hardly be blamed on him. His Connecticut boyhood, as he presented it, was the prototypical American story of hardships endured and triumphed over. Family poverty, his mother was left a widow at an early age, forced the young Barnum into a series of unsatisfying jobs, some of them on the family farm. "I never really liked to work," Barnum confessed later, and the plowing and cow driving he had to do was particularly unpleasant. By the age of 12, he had moved on to a country store where he could exercise his wits against both the owner and customers, trading and swapping goods for advantage. "My disposition is and ever was of a speculative nature," Barnum allowed. "Each party expected to be cheated if it was possible. Our eyes, and not our ears, had to be our masters." It was a hard school, but Barnum proved a good student, and he soon left home to try his luck in the big city. He did well enough in New York, but when his grandfather offered to set him up in business, Barnum returned to Connecticut to open his own store. This in 1828, the year that Andrew Jackson was elected president. Barnum himself was a Jacksonian Democrat, a firm believer in liberating the entrepreneurial spirit of the individual, unfettered by privileges or regulations. Various adventures soon followed, including bouts of selling lottery tickets while it was still legal, which wasn't too much longer in Connecticut. In those early years, Barnum also revealed a libertarian, or at least a contrarian streak that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As a committed Universalist in a conservative state that still enforced strong Sabbatarian laws, including some that forbade travel on the Sabbath, Barnum's protest against this legislation took the form of editing a newspaper. He called it the Herald of Freedom. Aggressively anti-clerical in tone, the newspaper took out after local clerics and dignitaries, particularly those defending the old Federalist order of things. Barnum was an enemy to sectarian interference in politics. He was prosecuted for libel by his adversaries and sentenced to jail for several weeks, although he was in a cell that had carpets and wallpaper. He emerged from his short stay in prison to a lively local celebration. So described normally as a man devoid of any principles at all, Barnum did have a streak of idealism, mixed with some cynicism, which underwrote a series of crusades. The Herald of Freedom was just his first. In the end, Barnum, newly married, was going to have to make a living. Connecticut didn't seem the place to do it, so he returned to the raucous, energetic city of New York in 1834, still searching for a career. Despite his varied experiences, he had reached the age of 25 without any signal success. He was back operating a grocery store and taking in boarders. But then, in a series of quick moves, this Connecticut Yankee discovered his vocation. He was at heart an impresario, capable of identifying popular favorites, promoting them, and taking them on tour. Barnum was not particularly sensitive to delicate feelings or sympathetic with the downtrodden, the excluded, or victims of racism, despite his civil libertarianism. And his attractions were highly varied. They included a European juggler, a traveling circus, a dancer, and most astonishing of all, an ex-slave, Joyce Heath, who claimed to have been George Washington's nurse and was, as the poster insisted, 161 years old. To publicize all of these, Barnum relied on tricks, exaggerations, trumped-up contests, and planted news stories. In the course of doing so, he made the discovery that, to use his words, the public appears disposed to be amused even while they are conscious of being deceived. This simple observation would become the basis of Barnum's early success. Fooling people was okay as long, first, as you gave them value for money, and second, explained to them just how they had been fooled. Imposture and deceit were legitimate in the pursuit of pleasure. And no one could be really sure about authenticity anyway. Experts, after all, and academics always disagreed. Everything depended, he wrote, upon getting people to think, to talk, to become curious and excited. So he actually encouraged this belief, certain that the challenge of proving him a liar would only add to his revenue. And one of the things he did with Joyce Heath was he spread the rumor that she was made of rubber, so people came back to look a second time. While Barnum had gained some reputation and a little money organizing these tours, after 6 or 7 years he got tired of being on the road so much of the time, and his attractions were not permanent. They got sick, they died, they found another manager. It was difficult for him to control his own destiny. I was thoroughly disgusted with the life of a traveling showman, he insisted. Itinerant amusements were at the bottom of the show business ladder. How could he remain an impresario and avoid the burdens of continuous travel? The answer, Barnum soon found out, was to create a permanent center for oddities and popular attractions and establish it in the country's largest city. And that was the start of the American Museum, the most popular theatrical attraction in the nation in the years before the Civil War. Buying out an older museum, Scudder's, and shortly incorporating another, Barnum, in a series of shrewd deals, now presided over an extraordinary collection of carefully chosen exhibits in what was called the American Museum. Now, the idea of a museum was pretty plastic at this time. There were in America almost no dedicated fine art museums. This was decades before creation of the Metropolitan Museum of Art or similar institutions in Chicago or Philadelphia or St. Louis. Museums were traditionally pastiches of historical relics, specimens of natural history, works of art, mechanical models, oddities, freaks, fossils, and skeletons. They had no professional curatorial staff. They had no diligent authenticators. The displays contained much that might be termed, generously, doubtful. And for the most part, in this day, they were privately owned. They were run for profit. They were highly competitive institutions serving audiences wanting entertainment. A few museum owners, like the famous painting family, the Peels, tried to administer strong doses of instruction along with the exhibits. But by the time Barnum arrived on the scene, they were close to failure. Barnum's genius was to retain the language of uplift, of morality and instruction, and marry it to an exciting repertoire of presentations, which included, among them, live acts. For the American Museum was not only a museum, it was also a theater, except that it wasn't quite called a theater. As a purveyor of family entertainments, in his own words, Barnum called it a lecture room. At a time when many middle-class Americans were still suspicious of theaters as sources of corruption and dangers to public morals, viewing acts or plays in a lecture hall seemed somehow safer and more moral. Barnum also scoured the world to find things, living or dead, that might be appealing. He sought ventriloquists, giants, dwarfs, magicians, albinos, glassblowers, automatons, jugglers, monsters, machines, anything that would raise eyebrows and attract attention. One of his coups at this time was leasing from a fellow museum owner in Boston an anatomical curiosity, some said an anatomical impossibility, called the Fiji mermaid, a strange-looking specimen that had the body of a fish and the head and hands of a monkey. Barnum arranged for tons of press coverage. He invited reporters in to have a look. He commissioned woodcuts and a descriptive pamphlet, along with lectures by a so-called naturalist explaining why this mermaid was in fact genuine. Placed on display in the American Museum, after weeks of publicity, crowds filed in to take a look. The mermaid, to large numbers of people, was clearly a fraud, manufactured for the occasion without any hope of being called authentic. Barnum cleverly played on doubters as well as believers. Whether it was the work of nature or art, one advertisement declared, it is decidedly the most stupendous curiosity ever submitted to the public for inspection. And in the face of indignation from real scientists, Barnum asked, who is to decide when doctors disagree? The mermaid went on tour, although she provoked a storm of controversy, particularly in the South, when clergymen and professors joined to denounce the exhibit as humbug. There was talk of libel suits to be brought against newspaper critics, but of course nothing came of that. Barnum himself was suspected of being behind some of the skepticism, anything for a good controversy. An English tourist visiting the American Museum reported that when he asked, is it real or is it humbug, Barnum replied, smiling, that's just the question. Persons who pay their money at the door have a right to form their own opinions after they have got upstairs. All we ask of an enlightened and honest public, he said at another point, is that it will pass a fair verdict and decide whether it be a humbug or not. One journalist wrote that after the public had paid and decided it was a humbug, Barnum accepted the decision and then moved the fraud on somewhere else. Remember, the America of his era encouraged debate and skepticism and competition. Every American believes himself to be the repository of extensive information, wrote an English critic. There were two major sins outside the Decalogue in the United States, he continued. One is to grow old, the other is not to know. So hoaxing becomes a part of national life and problem-solving a major sport. The New York Sun, a penny newspaper, in the 1830s, carries a story that the great British astronomer, Sir John Herschel, was using a new and powerful telescope, and he had penetrated the secrets of the moon. These were far more interesting than what we have discovered. On the moon were trees, pelicans, and winged men. 20,000 copies of the newspaper were sold each day in this series. I'll show you a detail. These were described in great detail. And it turned out, to much embarrassment, to have been invented by a local journalist, Richard Locke. 10 years later, in 1844, the same New York Sun announced that the Atlantic had been crossed by a balloon. Again, a hoax, although here is a drawing of the Victoria, the balloon that supposedly crossed the ocean, but the author of the hoax this time was Edgar Allan Poe. And this was, after all, the era that brought us, again by Poe, the detective story, with readers exercising their wits to figure out just who had committed the murders in the Rue Morgue. It was also a time that saw flourishing the How to Do It book. In Humbug, I call this taste an operational aesthetic, that is, a pleasure in seeing how things worked, in figuring out solutions to problems, in testing, examining, questioning, when science was daily revealing new marvels. Barnum was happy to participate in this enterprise. But his larger point was that what audiences liked in the free and independent and democratic state of America was good. People were meant to enjoy life's pleasures as they were offered, without being troubled by moralists, scientists, nitpickers who complained about deceit and exaggeration. Was there enjoyment, Barnum asked? Did pressure-ridden Americans relax? Did they get a good laugh? That was what counted. It was a preview of some of the justifications advertisers would offer when challenged about promised rewards said to come from consuming their products. But Barnum was not one-dimensional. He also located and promoted genuine attractions, authentic oddities, highly gifted performers, and sold them with the same panache he applied to his manufactured frauds. There was, for example, the case of Charles S. Stratton. Stratton was just 4 years old when Barnum met him. Connecticut-born, he stood 2 feet high and weighed 15 pounds. Tiny but perfectly proportioned, he was intelligent, appealing, quick to learn how to dance and sing, and most important of all, he was not growing. Once having met the boy, Barnum made a deal with his parents that made him, in effect, an indentured servant. It proved to be a great bargain. Barnum would board the family at his expense, pay them $7 a week, in return put the boy on exhibition in the museum lecture room, and take him on tour. The little boy proved immensely appealing, and he was now named General Tom Thumb, after a figure in English folklore associated with the court of King Arthur. More than 200 years before Barnum's discovery, the history of Tom Thumb was published in England and is generally acknowledged to be the first printed English fairy tale. Over the course of time, the story was retold quite often with new illustrations, so Americans were familiar with the name. But no one associated with the legend of Tom Thumb made more money than Barnum did, clearing tens of thousands of dollars in the first year. The little boy, no more than 5 when he first appeared, learned how to impersonate famous historical figures like Napoleon, another short person, and proved to be an engaging stage performer. Once the initial craze wore off, Barnum wrote a new contract, which brought the Strattons more wealth, and then took the boy off to England on what would be his first international tour. Realizing the very different social setting he was now in and the power of aristocracy in a hierarchical society, Barnum decided to aim his attention at the wealthy and titled, renting a house in a fashionable part of London and inviting neighbors in. He persuaded the American minister to Britain, Edward Everett, to use his influence with the royal family. And after Tom Thumb had been on display at the Egyptian Hall for several weeks, an invitation came from Buckingham Palace. Young Queen Victoria had a growing family of her own, and Tom Thumb managed to enchant them. He also got into a fight with the Queen's poodle, you can see on the right, who attacked him at one of these receptions, but he fought back vigorously. Several more invitations followed, and Barnum used this attention as part of his publicity, noting the dukes and the earls and the political leaders who had flocked to see his great attraction. Barnum himself was now becoming an international personality and began making trips to Paris to arrange for still more exhibitions. When General Tom Thumb, whose family now had a profit-sharing arrangement with the showman, when General Tom Thumb arrived in France, he was invited to the Tuileries Palace to perform for Louis Philippe and the court. The king, who would be overthrown by revolution in just a few years, was so impressed that he presented the performer with emeralds, granted special privileges to him like driving his carriage in reserved spaces, and so on. Barnum milked all of this publicity and sent Tom Thumb on a tour of the French provinces, during which he spread the news, entirely false, that the tiny general had been kidnapped, before reassuring the public that the boy had been rescued and now was safe. In the privacy of his own correspondence, Barnum confided, "There's plenty of money here, and I'll get a good bit of it." What the mid-1840s permitted Barnum was the opportunity to grow this international reputation. The European tours were so successful that he seemed to enjoy a Midas touch. The reception, however, was not necessarily one that Barnum entirely enjoyed, for he was seen increasingly as a semi-scrupulous, bargain-driving Yankee who epitomized the worst European fears of Americans, that they were materialistic, egotistical, soulless competitors driven by greed and love for money, prepared to trample over tradition, morality, and history in their brazen quest for fortune. Barnum didn't seem to mind the charges too much, and in typical American fashion, decided to outdo the old world in magnificence. During his English travels, he had been impressed by the extravagance of the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, erected by the Prince Regent, who would later become King George IV. Back in Connecticut, Barnum decided to construct his own Oriental palace, its domes and turrets bordered by fountains and gardens. The architect, Leopold Eidlitz, modeled it partly on the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. Barnum called it Iranistan, Eastern Country Place, and spared no expense. Its cost of $150,000 translates in our terms to something approaching $5 million. But it was in the end a business investment, as were most of Barnum's gestures. It may have satisfied his personal need for sensuous glitter and obvious opulence, but it could be reproduced on his business stationery, and it was. And it was also visible from the cars of the nearby New York and New Haven Railroad line, giving the impresario a permanent billboard of spectacular dimensions. Like many buildings Barnum was associated with, Iranistan did not last too long. It burned down in the 1850s, less than a decade after construction. Other houses, more solid and conventional, would follow, but Iranistan remained the popular favorite, a response to Barnum's own taste for luxury, but justified, as always, on the grounds of its advertising value. Barnum's next great touring adventure was quite a step up from Tom Thumb, from the standpoint of status. But the showman did not get involved because he hankered for the higher things of life. To him, exhibitions were commodities from which money could be extracted. He thought of them in pragmatic and prosaic terms. For some, he harbored affection, even admiration, but this never interfered with his fundamental goal, which was to identify assets which could be sold to ticket buyers and add to his personal fortune. The newest excursion involved music. Now, Barnum was not himself a significant music lover. He had famously employed a brass band on the balcony of his American Museum to play loud and terrible music in order to drive pedestrians inside to avoid the noise. But he decided in 1850 to launch what would become the most successful and best publicized musical tour yet attempted in this country. The singer, of course, was Jenny Lind, the young Swedish nightingale who had begun her career just a few years earlier and in the late 1840s had been entrancing audiences all over the continent and in London. She was adored by Queen Victoria, Frederick Chopin, Felix Mendelssohn, Clara Schumann, and a host of other celebrated figures. And in her concerts and operatic roles, she became nothing short of a rock star sensation. Audiences wept in her presence. Children, dogs, china were named after her. She sold out practically every hall she appeared in. More than that, Jenny Lind earned a reputation for her support of charitable causes. Single, attractive, modest, she projected a wholesome aura, unusual for performers in general and for opera singers in particular. Her enormous success piqued Barnum's interest. He was always on the lookout for unusual attractions. Now, Jenny Lind would not be the first great European performer to undertake an American tour. Actors, violinists, conductors, dancers, and singers had tapped into the rich market here for decades. Fanny Elsler, the Viennese dancer, Old Bull, a Norwegian violinist, Henri Hertz, a pianist, all had invaded America and done well. But Barnum had something more spectacular in mind. He decided, without ever having heard her sing, to sign Jenny Lind to an amazing contract. He had no knowledge of or even interest in her musical capacities, but he realized that with her talent, her beauty, and her modest personality, she could be sold to American audiences who were not normally interested in music. He was willing to pay, which was good because Jenny Lind did not come cheap. She demanded and she got salaries and expenses for a companion, a secretary, a male singer, and an orchestra director. And in addition, the guarantee of $150,000 for 150 concerts. Barnum was committing himself to more than $187,000, again in present-day values, $5 million, again, never having heard her perform. It showed breathtaking self-confidence, something that the showman never lacked, a willingness to obey his instincts, and the capacity to develop a strategy to promote this attraction by any means possible. Barnum, said one of his competitors at the time, was totally indifferent whether he produced excitement for Jenny Lind as a musician or as a personality. He would work her up as a curiosity. Reputation, he went on, was manufactured for her by wholesale. It was not merely made by the inch, but prepared by the cartload. With this in mind, Barnum organized his campaign. First, he commissioned biographies of Jenny Lind to be printed in the thousands, emphasizing her dedication to good works and her interest in philanthropy. He wrote newspaper editors a letter in which he described Jenny Lind as a gift from heaven whose visit would prove a blessing to America. He organized a song contest to commemorate Jenny Lind's welcome to America. Within a week, 700 entries had poured in. By the time Jenny Lind arrived in New York Harbor, tens of thousands of people were covering the pier and 20,000 gathered near the hotel that she was staying at, with New York musical groups coming to serenade her through the night, some of the crowd in one representation. Americans congratulated themselves on their new enthusiasm for culture. The New York Tribune declared that Jenny Lind's popularity showed that our great people, so bewildered at times by the rapidity of their progress, have not forgotten the capacity of appreciating excellence in a new form. Further increasing the excitement, Barnum decided to have an auction for tickets to her first performance. Thousands of people attended, and a New York businessman, a hat seller named Jenin, bid $225 for the privilege of buying the first ticket. His business immediately jumped. Out west, auctions were held of Jennings hats in California mining camps to celebrate the person who had bid so much money to buy the first ticket to a Jenny Lind concert. Thousands of other dollars were spent that auction night, and an immense crowd, 5,000 people, jammed Castle Garden to hear of the soprano. They were enthralled. When Barnum declared that Jenny Lind was giving her share of the profits, more than $10,000, to two local charities, the adulation only increased. The second night, ticket sales were more than $14,000, again in today's terms, $250,000. One cynical New Yorker asserted that if the greatest man that had lived for the last 10 centuries were here in her place, the uproar and excitement would be less. Frenzied auctions for the first ticket followed in other places like Boston and Providence, successful bidders sometimes reaching $500 and occasionally not even bothering to attend the concert. In her wake, Jenny Lind left a vast array of consumables behind: horses, theaters, steamboats, cigars, whole towns, and furniture were named for her. The English were particularly baffled and concerned by Lindomania, as it was called, a wave of public emotion, something like a moral epidemic, they said, which in the wrong hands could have disastrous political impact. That which can be done by a private adventurer, cried the Times of London about Barnum, may with more ease be accomplished by the leader of a faction. In words that resonate today, it went on, the same arts which make a singer's popularity may create the political capital of a president. The deliberate substitute of prejudice for reason and experience may be applied to measures as well as to music. Barnum was now viewed by conservatives on both sides of the Atlantic as actively dangerous, a public relations wizard, an opinion maker whose power threatened to engulf long-established traditions of propriety. Barnum, declared an anonymous critic in New York, was, and I quote, an insolent, shameless, reckless, ambitious reprobate whose deeds so vividly, so truthfully attest the residence of the devil, and whose glory henceforth can be naught save the well-merited scorn and execration of an outraged Christian public. We think we are living in an age of vitriol today. It hardly compares with the 19th century. It's not easy to understand the fury of the hostility at Barnum, which was partly fueled by the immense profits he was making. But there was something else. Jenny Lind, after all, unlike the Fiji Mermaid and several of his other frauds, was not actually a hoax. She was widely acknowledged to be one of the greatest singers of her age. Her formal performances were filled with great music. It was rather that by patronizing and promoting her, or partaking of any Barnum-provided attractions, that audiences somehow had become complicit in a web of exaggerated advertising, tainted by the merchandising effort that was aimed at the broadest possible market. This would become a recurrent dilemma for audiences in the coming century, the selling of high culture through techniques developed elsewhere. Barnum's apologists could insist that the impresario was simply bringing great art to the masses. His detractors could be equally vocal, denouncing what they saw as the vulgarizing pitch of a carnival master now attached to things they held sacred. There was obviously nothing that Barnum couldn't sell, given enough time, and one of his best products was himself. That became apparent a few years after the Lind tour finished. Barnum cleared, according to some estimates, $500,000 from her tour. Again, today's $5 to $10 million. He was a rich man, a huge change from the struggling grocer of 10 or 12 years earlier, and he decided in 1854 to share his success story and make even more money by writing and publishing an autobiography. He would live another 47 years, and this allowed him to bring out new editions almost annually. But the earliest version of his life is probably the most revealing and essential to understanding the man. Artful in its own way, apparently candid, certainly unapologetic, the text allowed Barnum to take on the mantle of a quintessential American capitalist in an age dominated both by egalitarian values and the ambition to get rich. He presented himself to the public as a hard-working businessman engaged in enterprises whose legitimacy was demonstrated by his own bank book, by happy customers who continued to stream into his enterprises. But more than that, Barnum, like many another exposer, made his readers complicit in his own acts of deceit. Without admitting that he had ever done anything dishonest, he described just how his array of attractions had been surrounded by aggressive publicity strategies, false stories planted in newspapers, misleading descriptions, stunts, fictional narratives, artificial excitements, anything to increase interest and expand sales. In several of these exploits, Barnum presented himself as a benevolent servant of public taste, reluctantly pushed into some borderline deceits simply to serve some larger purpose and to satisfy public demand. Thus, in his autobiography, he described the notorious episode of the woolly horse. In 1848, he encountered in Cincinnati a small animal whose body and limbs were covered with thick, fine hair. Purchasing him on the spot, Barnum stowed the horse in a Bridgeport barn until he wrote, "Such times as I might have use for him." The occasion came when Colonel John Fremont, you see here, a military hero who would soon be running for president, was reported to have been lost in the Rockies. There was widespread fear that Fremont had been the victim of a severe winter, but at last there was news of his safety. The public heart beat quick with joy, Barnum went on. I now saw a chance for the woolly horse. Covered with blankets, he was brought to a New York stable where no one could see him. There then appeared a news story planted by Barnum that Fremont had succeeded in capturing an extraordinary animal, a nondescript, resembling a horse, but without mane or tail and covered with a thick coat of wool. And then an announcement in the New York papers that Colonel Fremont's woolly horse would be exhibited for several days in the city, a complex being made up of the elephant, deer, horse, buffalo, camel, and sheep. Transparencies were created, none have survived, alas, of the horse, pursued by Fremont and his soldiers, and Barnum commissioned drawings for handbills and posters. Barnum wrote, the public appetite was craving something tangible for Colonel Fremont. The community was absolutely famishing. They were ravenous. They could have swallowed anything. And like a good genius, I threw them not a bone, but a bonbon. And they swallowed it in a single gulp. Barnum stopped only when Fremont's father-in-law, Senator Thomas Benton of Missouri, arrested his agent for false pretenses. But he couldn't prove, in Fremont's absence, that Fremont had never seen the animal. Such testimony could not prove a negative, Barnum wrote, and the complaint was thrown out. However, out of regard to Benton's feelings, Barnum confessed, I ordered the horse back to Bridgeport, where in time he gave his last kick. Unhappily, the woolly horse continued to kick Fremont, who was running for president in 1856, and here you can see a cartoonist version of the horse with Fremont atop it. Now, these frank confessions, multiplied dozens of times over, gave the autobiography much of its power and armed Barnum's critics and opponents with ammunition they would deploy again and again in coming centuries. Deception and exposure went hand in hand. The very phrase confidence man had been coined just a few years earlier by a New York newspaper. It seemed to be invented for Barnum, and now he was profiting from it as a popular author. There was once a time, an infuriated critic wrote, when people must have lived lives before they could sell them. It was necessary for them to have been something or done something, but not Barnum. How could Americans read, he went on, the shameless confession of a common impostor who has taken the money of the public by downright falsehood? Any feelings of affection for Barnum had to rest on sympathy with trickery. Barnum, wrote another reviewer, was just that type of low-minded, money-making, vulgar and shallow Yankee that hostile Europeans loved to lampoon. Indeed, some of the British reviewers declared the autobiography Barnum's most daring hoax, justifying amazement at its audacity, loathing for its hypocrisy, abhorrence for the moral obliquity which it betrays, and pity for the wretched man who compiled it. He has nothing left for his worst enemy to do. The humor magazine, Punch, proposed Barnum for president, a complete representative of the whole nation, it said, the type and symbol of the glorious republic. That Barnum surrounded his tales with professions of piety, that he was a temperance advocate, a teetotaler, anti-slavery, only made matters worse for his adversaries. Self-righteousness highlighted his other defects. Barnum himself was content to sell copies of his book rather than take on his critics. Essentially, he was laughing all the way to the bank, but not long after its first publication, he faced far greater problems. Having made several fortunes from his touring acts and the American Museum, he found himself by the late 1850s bankrupt. He blamed his misfortunes on having unwisely signed a letter of credit for a friend which left him in the hole for $500,000. But it's certainly possible that his style of living contributed to the problem. Barnum declared he had been taught a lesson. I quote, "The man who coins his brain and blood into gold, who wastes all of his time and thought upon the almighty dollar, was not investing in the right things. He took the misadventure as an opportunity for more moralizing, infuriating still further his adversaries, who realized that he was still a wealthy man. Barnum quickly embarked on a European tour with Tom Thumb to regain his fortune, and among other things prepared a lecture entitled The Art of Money Getting. He confessed in a later edition of the autobiography that he felt he was more competent to speak on the art of money losing, but his friends pointed out that he couldn't have lost money unless he had made it in the first place. He repeated his talk 100 times in England and had it printed. Money getters are the benefactors of our race, he declared, donors of colleges, churches, and museums. The history of money getting is a history of civilization. The bromides and formulas that he presented in his talk, preserve your integrity, read the newspapers, don't mistake your vocation, these were conventional enough, but they worked. With a sonorous voice, as described by journalists, and a good platform presence, within 5 years, he was fully independent again, aided partially by receipts from his increasingly popular lecturing. Now, it's about here, little more than midway in his life's journey, that it may be appropriate to start reaching to an end. Many great adventures lay ahead for Barnum, and a string of memorable hoaxes and international outrages. And there was, of course, his creation of a touring circus and menagerie, which in partnership with veterans like W.C. Kalp and James Bailey would lead in time to the greatest show on earth, the Barnum and Bailey Great London Circus. This is Barnum's claim on immortality. But as you can see, it followed upon decades of involvement with animals, with acrobats, with human oddities, three of the staples of circus performance. He counted the end of his public life, as he put it, in 1868, when his second American Museum building burned to the ground, the first in 1865, an even more spectacular fire. However, he had more than 20 years of activity ahead. The hoaxes continued. There was the Cardiff Giant, built by Barnum and placed on exhibition, but actually the replica of another manufactured fraud discovered supposedly in New York State, and it was the manager of that fraud that developed the phrase, "There's a sucker born every minute." There was the curious case of the white elephant, imported from Siam with great fanfare by Barnum, the real thing for a change, which unfortunately did not look very white. It was soon outdone by a whitewashed elephant created by one of Barnum's circus competitors, Adam Forepaugh. And most of all, there was Jumbo, the largest African elephant in captivity, a favorite of the London Zoo, and hordes of child visitors who climbed upon its back. And here Barnum earned the envy of millions of Britons who were entering a whole era of losing things to their relations across the Atlantic. Upon hearing in 1882 that the zoo might get rid of its prime attraction as it entered a period of unpredictable adolescence, difficult for elephants as for human beings, Barnum made a large cash offer, $10,000, which was quickly accepted. Despite the protests of thousands, including Queen Victoria, the sale went through, and Jumbo sailed for America and several years of stardom in the circus. Here you can see Jumbo's arrival in New York. The elephant actually refused to move for a while in England out of his place in the zoo, and it took a great deal of persuasion. This was another shrewd investment, for Jumbo sold tickets, books, souvenirs, and trademarks. But long before this time, Barnum had achieved the status he had been aiming for since his earliest days as a showman, that of a brand, a recognizable, predictable, highly successful commodity, broadly identifiable, and defined by popular perception. Reputation, transferable reputation, was what an impresario needed, and Barnum's whole career had been built around its pursuit. His principal merchandise was pleasure rather than authenticity, excitement rather than certainty, and audaciousness rather than good taste or restraint. In his later years, whenever anything particularly dramatic was rumored about to take place in the world, Barnum's name could be attached and the information seemed plausible. The more emphatic the violation of propriety or moderation, the more likely Barnum was to be involved. Thus, in 1890, and Barnum was now almost 80, stories floated that Anne Hathaway's cottage in Stratford-upon-Avon, the childhood home of William Shakespeare's wife, was going to be sold to Americans for exhibition in Chicago during the great 1893 Columbian Exposition. The Times of London feared that behind one of these offers was P.T. Barnum, who was expected to trundle the house about on wheels like a caravan of wild beasts, giants, or dwarfs. There's no evidence that Barnum considered purchasing the house, but mere mention of his involvement spurred Parliament into action and invested upon Stratford-on-Avon as trustees of Shakespeare's birthplace, allowing them to purchase what would become the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. And there it remains to this day. Barnum must have reveled in the rumors. Publicity of any kind was good. All I have I owe to the American press, he once remarked. The only liquid you can never have too much of is printer's ink. On the other hand, he was at pains in later editions of his autobiography to emphasize his claims to respectability and respect. He was a family man, and his first marriage, producing 4 daughters, ended only with the death of his wife. He then soon remarried a much younger woman, Nancy Fish, and various stories did float about some affairs, including an improbable one with Jenny Lind, but Barnum was on the whole a respectable, a family man, building his children houses, giving them employment, and real estate and enjoying his grandchildren. A house on Fifth Avenue, an estate in Connecticut, impressive real estate there and in the far west, an active political career in Bridgeport, where he was mayor, all testified to his public interests, as did a special concern with park building and municipal improvements. All this Barnum recorded in his memoirs, emphasizing his adherence to conventional morality, his liberal philanthropy, and his general benevolence. But private feelings were not a part of his largest strategy of exposure. His deepest thoughts he kept to himself. Surviving letters from early years indicate, as I said earlier, he tended to treat his attractions as business investments, pure and simple, with relatively little attention paid to their feelings or even simple humanity. His advertisements touted the melange of displays, but they were there for box office returns. There were, to be sure, certain limits. When he became, as it were, in his later years, a national clearinghouse for the bizarre and the unbelievable, Barnum received many letters from Americans proposing that he exhibit their oddly appearing pets or relatives. Some of the suggestions were so strange that Mark Twain actually thought of collaborating with him and producing a book about this dark corner of the American psyche. A few correspondents seemed ready to produce whatever deformities might yield profit. Barnum, however, did not encourage the creation of oddities. He marketed what was already available. In these later years, Barnum acquired something of the character of a cultural sage. The circus was turning less into a competitive contest of wills, its customers trying to outsmart the wily showman, and more into an extravagant spectacle, its audiences reduced to passive viewership. The three rings, separated by two additional stages, were an innovation of Barnum and Bailey, designed to keep people in their seats by bringing performers close to just about everyone in the long, oblong tents. More than 1,500 people, along with hundreds of animals, took part in some of these spectacles. Barnum relied heavily on his partners, first Coop and Bailey, for active management. The circus, however, was so complex as a traveling operation, so perfectly tuned that in the late 19th century, it attracted the interest and attention of the German general staff in Berlin. They were absorbed by the railroad movements of men and horses rather than elephants and giraffes, but the coordinating challenges remained the same. Ironically, then, despite the fact that his name is attached irrevocably to the circus, this was probably the least original part of Barnum's professional career. His brand had been established 40 years earlier with the Fiji Mermaid, General Tom Thumb, and Jenny Lind. When a young man on the make, Barnum had figured out just what Americans liked to see. He was a gambler, a risk-taker, a provocateur in the years before the Civil War. It was in the later period that the sober, patriarchal image that I first encountered on circus posters was emphasized more and more. It was as if, having been associated with so many oddities during his long life, Barnum wanted to highlight his own perfect ordinariness, his conventional, even conservative values about business, domesticity, and personal conduct, a code which brought him close to what his great predecessor, Benjamin Franklin, had preached in his autobiography. But unlike Franklin, Barnum kept his innermost thoughts to himself, and more than a century after his death remains a personal mystery, the master of publicity who was also a master of privacy. Thanks very much.
Questions, Bill?
Yeah, did Barnum have an entourage of hangers-on when he was doing these things? Before the circus, the Jenny Lind, et cetera, did he have a lot of people helping him, or did he basically do it by himself?
Well, I'll get back to the mic. I couldn't hear it, that's why I moved away. He had people helping him. That is, for example, someone told him about Tom Thumb. He didn't just meet him by accident on a Connecticut street. All the Fiji Mermaid had been exhibited by another museum proprietor named Moses Kimball. His gift was to take something that had already been found and make of it something which would be immensely interesting and popular. And that, I think, was his own particular genius. Then he relied on a network of correspondents, writers, journalists, and in his later years he had secretaries, of course, to help him out. But I think in his early years, it was his eye. He would spot something that he knew could work, provided it was worked up. And that was his particular gift. He recognized it, and he also knew how to change it to different circumstances. That's why the Tom Thumb in England was a differently presented Tom Thumb than the Tom Thumb in the United States. So I think a lot of it was his insight, and then he would rely on organization afterward.
Would you say that Bailey's participation and partnership with Barnum was in part because of his necessity and the wide scope of the greatest show on earth, but could you go into a little bit of Bailey's background?
Well, Bailey was sort of outdrawing Barnum when Barnum decided to combine with him. The Great London Circus, Bailey was a circus man, and he was an experienced manager. He was the person who brought the three rings. Barnum's early partner, W.C. Coop, C-O-U-P, was also an experienced circus man who developed two rings. But Bailey had worked on circuses for some years. He was a master of getting attractions together and of assembling big spectacles. Barnum recognized this. By this time, Barnum was a brand, as I suggested in the talk, and he brought to the circus his reputation rather than particular skill in organizing it. Now, Barnum had been involved with animal acts. He created a hippodrome in New York in 1869-70. That was the start of it. But he wasn't really a master circus thinker. And as you know, the world of the circus has its own special and specialized group of followers. And I don't want to get into details of circus history because I don't know as much as many other people do. But Bailey was certainly much more of a specialist than Barnum.
Question back here.
Was there any overlap between Robert Ripley, the Believe It or Not guy, and Barnum? I mean, Ripley was later, I guess.
Yes. Well, I don't know much about Ripley. I've been to one or two of the Believe It or Not spots, and Ripley had a newspaper column. This was all 20th century. Barnum died in 1891. So there's at least a generation of distance between them. Whether Ripley knew much about Barnum, whether he admired Barnum, that I can't tell you because I just don't know anything about his life. But they did not overlap, at least from a time standpoint.
Back here, a question or a comment. Ed?
A comment. I'm not sure how many knew that at 5:45 this evening, the circus train actually rolled through Fredericksburg on the RF&P line, as observed from Caroline Street. So what a coincidence, to say the least.
We planned that, of course, and I'm glad that Ed saw it. I hope some of the rest of you saw it. Can you imagine that the train actually came through Fredericksburg earlier this evening? Other questions, comments?
In that period, of course, there would be great circus parades, which were as much a part of the circus appeal as their actual acts. And the museum in Baraboo, the Ringling Brothers Museum, the Ringling Brothers came from Wisconsin. They, until recently, every 4th of July in Milwaukee, would have a parade incorporating these extraordinary wagons and chariots that were, again, part of the circus's larger function, which is basically all but disappeared now. But it was a kind of appetizer to the main course that would come when you bought a ticket to see the circus itself.
Here's a question.
You answered my question before I had a chance to ask it. But I was wondering if you could say, first it was Barnum and Bailey, and then it was the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. And I was wondering if you could, you said that that was not your thing, was history, but circus history. But I wonder how this all kind of played out.
Well, James Bailey died at a relatively a young age. The story is that he was bitten by a monkey, and he died as a result of it. The Ringlings were from Wisconsin. They were originally a German family, and they eventually bought out the Barnum and Bailey name to sort of combine forces, and circuses were being combined all the time. You could argue that the great age of the circus was also the great age of Standard Oil. I mean, this is a time when all sorts of things were being pulled together. The Ringlings went on to own the circus for quite a few years, and one of the Ringlings, of course, created a museum in Florida, which became circus headquarters for a while. The winter headquarters for the circus in Barnum's lifetime was in Bridgeport, an unlikely site, if you will. Bridgeport is still the home for the Barnum Museum. Barnum created, by his will and a number of philanthropic gifts, the Barnum Institute of, I think he called it, Art and Science. It's an interesting story again. Barnum had wanted to leave the money to the YMCA, but because he was a Universalist, he wasn't considered part of the recognized spectrum of Christianity. And as I say, he was very proud of his universalism and hostile to strict denominationalism. Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts is a Universalist Unitarian foundation, and their football team, when they had one, were called the Jumbos. Barnum bequeathed the skeleton of Jumbo to the Smithsonian and the stuffed Jumbo to Tufts, although they were placed on exhibition at the circus for some time. So there are interesting interminglings which I couldn't go into here about business, politics, religion, and entertainment, which his life as a whole epitomizes, and the sort of the giant combination that becomes the greatest show on earth is part of the larger pattern of consolidation and integration which you find taking place elsewhere in American business life during this period.
Well, Professor Harris, thank you very, very much for an entertaining talk, and please give him a hand.
Thank you. Thank you very much.